We welcome you to another episode of the History of Africans on our channel. Today, we'll be taking you on a journey of exploration where we see the history of Africans in America. We want to know how Africans became part of the country and who were these Africans. Present-day African Americans are members of today's tribes who made up present Africa. It begins with the transatlantic slave trade, a dark chapter in human history where millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, African men, women, and children endured unspeakable horrors as they were captured, chained, and shipped as commodities to work on plantations in the New World. The origins of the transatlantic slave trade can be traced back to the 15th century when European powers, primarily Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands, began to establish colonies in the Caribbean, North America, and South America. In order to meet up with the demand for labor in these colonies, African slaves were captured and transported across the Atlantic Ocean in appalling conditions. The majority of the enslaved Africans were taken from regions along the western coast of Africa, including present-day countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and Angola. These areas were targeted due to their proximity to the coast and the presence of established trading networks. Upon the slaves' arrival in the Americas, they were subjected to brutal exploitation on plantations, mines, and other labor-intensive industries. They were made to toil under harsh conditions for the economic benefit of their masters. Several African slaves found their place of work in the southern colonies of North America, particularly in states like Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, where large-scale plantations were predominant, and there was a high demand for labor for the cultivation of crops such as tobacco, cotton, and rice. Many Africans were also enslaved in domestic service, working in European households as cooks, maids, and laborers. Despite the dehumanizing conditions of slavery, Africans on the continent preserved their culture and traditions. Through music, art, and oral traditions, they forged a sense of identity and community in the face of oppression. The first step of becoming part of America for the enslaved Africans started with the continual exploitation the people faced in the hands of their owners. Plantations were the economic backbone of the South, relying heavily on enslaved labor to cultivate cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Enslaved Africans endured deadly work schedules, harsh living conditions, and brutal treatment at the hands of their masters. As a result, many slaves began to resist their oppressors. Enslaved Africans were found in different acts of rebellion, sabotage, and escape in their bid to challenge the institution of slavery. The fight for freedom and equality was relentless. Thousands of slaves used their underground railroad and a network of secret routers and safe houses for their escape. Thanks to the sacrifice of great men like Harriet Tubman, who risked their lives to guide slaves to freedom. At the time, the North had experienced the eruption of a growing abolitionist movement fueled by the moral outrage over the horrors of slavery. Abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and William Lloyd Garrison advocated for the immediate end of slavery, and the recognition of the humanity and rights of every enslaved African. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 brought the tension between the North and South over slavery to a head. His victory and the promise of eradicating the expansion of slavery into new territories terrified the southern states. The attack of the Confederates on Fort Sumter in South Carolina in April 1861 brought about the beginning of the Civil War. It was the war that eventually decided the fate of slavery in America. The Union led by President Lincoln was pitted against the Confederate states who were fighting to preserve their way of life, which included the institution of slavery. In 1863, President Lincoln made the Emancipation Proclamation, which was the declaration that prevented the Confederates from having slaves. Every slave held by the Confederate was to be set free. The abolition of slavery represented a monumental reality in American history. The period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, offered a glimmer of hope for African Americans. Following the abolition of slavery after the Civil War, the Reconstruction era brought hope for equality and citizenship rights. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. However, the promise of Reconstruction was short-lived as discriminatory laws and practices such as Jim Crow segregation emerged, denying African Americans their rights and perpetuating racial inequality. These challenges led to the need for African Americans to start a new fight for freedom, which is the fight for equality. The 20th century brought about a rise in the need for a fight for equality and civil rights. The civil rights movement of the century marked a great turning point in the struggle for equality. Visionary leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X led African Americans to challenge segregation, discrimination, and suppression they were subjected to. A monumental achievement was reached with the introduction of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These acts outlawed segregation and discrimination based on race and ensured voting rights for African Americans. These legislative victories laid the foundation for the full inclusion of African Americans as citizens of the United States. A further notable victory for the African Americans was recorded in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama as the nation's first African American president. His presidency symbolized progress and possibility, inspiring future generations to believe in the power of change and the promise of a more inclusive society. As we reflect on the history of African Americans, we are reminded of the enduring legacy of resilience, perseverance, and hope. Today, African Americans are an integral part of the fabric of American society, contributing to every aspect of culture, politics, and economics. States such as New York, California, Texas, Florida, and Georgia are home to vibrant African American communities, enriching the nation with their diverse perspectives and experiences. This is the story of how our African brothers and sisters who were enslaved over 400 years ago became an integral part of the land where they were once possessed. For more interesting and educative African stories, subscribe to our channel and turn on your notification bell. This is African History TV.